welcome to another deep dive. If you're joining us today, do us a massive favor right off the bat, and please like and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you these intense, unfiltered explorations.
Yes, definitely hit that subscribe button.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today's deep dive is, it is an absolute behemoth. We are looking at a massive, highly provocative new ebook titled The Living Spirit, Resurrecting the West by Conrad Riker.
It really is a massive text.
It is, and I want to pitch this directly to you, the listener. If you are interested in the men's rights space, the manosphere, or if you simply want a red-pilled, unflinching perspective on how Western institutions were historically captured by Marxist and feminist ideologies, this deep dive is going to be an ultra-long, incisive, and just a fascinating roadmap for you.
Unflinching is definitely the right word for it.
Yeah, it's a dense, unapologetic survival manual for the modern cultural landscape. And look, if you want to read along or dive in yourself, you can buy the book right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. We also highly urge you to follow the author on Substack at Conrad and Riker.
Right, but before we take a single step further, it's quite the journey we're about to take. And we need to lay down a very important mandatory impartiality disclaimer.
Yes. Very important.
Because the source material we are covering today is highly politically charged. It touches on cultural Marxism, feminism, biological gender dynamics, and institutional capture.
All the heavy hitters.
Exactly. And because of the intense nature of this text, we must explicitly state that we are not taking sides or endorsing these viewpoints.
Right, we're not advocating here.
No. Our job today is strictly to act as impartial guides. We are going to map out the author's arguments, his specific syllogisms, and his historical claims exactly as they are presented in the text. This is about allowing you, the listener, to fully understand the mechanics and the architecture of the author's worldview without us putting a thumb on the scale in either direction.
Absolutely. We're just the tour guides through this incredibly complex intellectual architecture today.
Yeah.
And the initial setup of this book, it hits hard and fast.
It really does.
The core premise here is that the West is currently suffering from what the author calls a woke mind virus. But he doesn't see this as some organic cultural shift, like a natural evolution of social mores or some accident of history.
Like he views it as highly intentional.
Right. He frames it as a deliberate, meticulously orchestrated demolition of the masculine intellect. He argues that over the last century, men have been chemically and culturally castrated by an elite class that actually despises the very fuel that built the modern world in the first place.
Which he defines strictly as male competence and aggression.
Yes, exactly.
What's fascinating here is how the author traces the lineage of this demolition. He doesn't just point to the last 10 years of social media or whatever. He argues that this is the result of a calculated long march through the institutions.
Let's define that for the listener, because that's a crucial concept to grasp.
Right, so the idea is that instead of conquering a society through a violent, bloody revolution or direct economic warfare like we saw in Russia or China, you conquer a society by slowly infiltrating its cultural pillars.
From the inside out.
Exactly. You take over the universities, the media conglomerates, the corporate boardrooms, the HR departments.
The thesis here is that this slow march was designed specifically to replace classical Western logos.
And by logos, we're talking about reason, logic, and a commitment to objective truth.
Yes. He claims that logos has been systematically replaced with emotional subjectivity and a culture of perpetual grievance.
And to understand exactly how we got to this point of emotional subjectivity, the book provides a very specific historical diagnosis, which brings us to the anatomy of cultural Marxism. He points directly to the Frankfurt School.
Also known as the Institute for Social Research.
Right. And I was reading this part of the notes late last night, and the historical timeline absolutely blew my mind. According to the text, this group of Marxist thinkers packed their bags, fled the Weimar Republic in Europe, and eventually set up shop right at Columbia University in New York City in 1934.
Right into the Ivy League.
Exactly. He describes this not as an academic migration, but as an intellectual infection injected directly into the heart of the American Academy.
And the key figures he focuses on here are philosophers and sociologists like Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse. The book argues that these thinkers had a massive realization during that era.
What was the realization?
They realized that classical economic Marxism, the stuff Karl Marx actually wrote about, had completely failed to spark a communist revolution in the industrialized West.
Because capitalism was working too well.
Precisely. Western capitalism was simply too successful.
The working class citizens were too prosperous, too comfortable, and too satisfied with their middle class lives, their cars, and their white picket fences to rise up and violently overthrow their employers.
They had too much to lose.
Right. So, according to this historical framing, they had to pivot. They completely shifted the battleground. If economic class warfare wouldn't work, they had to invent cultural and gender warfare. Yeah, they took the old Marxist dichotomy of bourgeoisie versus proletariat and replaced it with men versus women, white versus black, and generally oppressor versus oppressed across dozens of new identity markers.
Hold on, let me stop you right there, because this is the part that genuinely stopped me in my tracks. There is a deeply surprising historical claim in the text regarding capitalist complicity.
The Rockefeller stuff.
Yes, the author points out this massive irony. He says, the capitalists essentially funded the rope for their own hanging. He pulls up historical financial records from the Rockefeller Foundation, revealing that between 1933 and 1945, they provided over $200,000 in grants to the Frankfurt School.
Which is millions in today's money.
Exactly. Adjusted for inflation, we were talking about millions of dollars. Why on earth would the Rockefellers, the ultimate ultra-wealthy capitalist oligarchs fund radical Marxist sociology? It sounds completely counterintuitive to you and me.
It does seem totally contradictory at first glance. Why would billionaires fund people who ostensibly want to destroy capitalism? But the author provides a very specific, cynical explanation for this.
Okay, hear it.
He argues that these globalist corporate elites actually shared a common goal with the Marxists. They both wanted to destroy the traditional cultural bedrock of the West. Specifically, they wanted to dismantle the nuclear family, the church, and the concept of the sovereign nation state.
Because those things provide independence.
Exactly. In this view, a strong, self-sufficient patriarchal family unit is a fortress of independence. If a man has a strong family and a local community, he doesn't need the state, and he isn't entirely dependent on megacorporations.
So they needed to break that down.
Right. If you can break that family unit down, you atomize the population, you strip away their local loyalties and turn men and women into isolated, rootless, pleasure-seeking individuals. The Rockefellers, according to the text, essentially bought a cultural revolution to create a borderless consumer marketplace.
They wanted consumers, not citizens.
Yes. They wanted to turn citizens into isolated, highly predictable purchasing units who rely entirely on corporate products to fill the void left by the destruction of the family.
That is a staggering way to look at the intersection of big business and radical academia. But to achieve this massive social engineering project, the author argues they needed a psychological weapon. They needed to pathologize the normal, traditional man.
And this is where he brings up Theodore Adorno's book.
Right, The Authoritarian Personality, published shortly after World War II. The text we are diving into completely dismisses this work, calling it pure pseudoscience. He claims its actual hidden purpose was not to fight real fascism or prevent another Holocaust, but to frame traditional fatherhood, patriotism, family loyalty, and classic Western stoicism as literal mental disorders.
Yes, the text states that if a man simply embodied the traditional role of a masculine protector and provider, someone aligned with classical virtues, holding strict moral boundaries, he was suddenly diagnosed by this new, heavily funded sociological framework as having a psychological aberration.
He was a proto-fascist.
Exactly. He was labeled a proto-fascist. This is the exact mechanism by which the Long March through the institutions operated. It acted like a viral load, slowly rewriting the host society's cultural DNA so the society would begin to attack its own foundational immune system.
And he points out that this linguistic and psychological warfare shamed men into abandoning their natural leadership roles.
Which conveniently paved the way for massive administrative bureaucracies and the state to take over the role of provider and protector.
Right. And he connects this slow-motion cultural coup to a very precise, chilling timeline outlined by Yuri Bezmenov.
The KGB defector.
Yes, a famous KGB defector from the Cold War era. Bezmenov detailed 4 distinct stages of ideological subversion, and the author maps these perfectly onto our current cultural moment.
Let's walk through those stages.
So first is demoralization. Let's break that down. He says we've endured this for the last 50 years. Entire generations being taught in schools to explicitly hate their own history, to view their ancestors only through the lens of their worst sins.
Then comes destabilization.
Right, which is where the economy, the borders, and the social fabric begin to actively fray. Then crisis, which the author likens to the intense periods of societal breakdown we've seen recently, like the tearing down of historical statues and the burning of city centers during protests.
And finally, the 4th stage, normalization.
This one is scary.
It is.
The author
Very-
makes the very sobering argument that we are currently, right now, transitioning from the crisis stage into the normalization stage. Normalization is the permanent bureaucratic installation of this new ideological tyranny.
It's the new status quo.
Exactly. It is the phase where the madness, the gaslighting, and the complete inversion of objective truth are cemented as the new, unquestionable law of the land. It's the point where fighting back is no longer just frowned upon, but potentially criminalized.
Man. And this cultural self-hatred that drives these four stages is beautifully, albeit darkly, summarized in the text by a concept from the late conservative philosopher Roger Scruton.
Oikophobia.
Yes, the book relies heavily on Scruton's idea of oikophobia. For you listening, let's explain that term. Oiko comes from the Greek for home or household, and phobia obviously means fear or hatred. So, oikophobia is the literal hatred of one's own home, one's own people, or one's own civilization.
It's a localized hatred.
Right. The author argues that the modern political left is deeply infected with this spiritual sickness. They instinctively flinch at classical Western achievements, whether it's architecture, literature, or space exploration, but they constantly genuflect to foreign cultures or outright barbarism.
He calls it a culture of repudiation.
Yes, a culture of repudiation, where modern academics act like intellectual vultures. They feed on the carcass of Western civilization, tearing down the greatness of dead men because they simply do not possess the talent, the drive, or the courage to build anything new in its place.
It is a profound, sweeping diagnosis of civilizational decay. But what keeps this book from just being a depressing history lesson is that the author doesn't just diagnose the disease. He spends a massive, significant portion of the text outlining the antidote.
The survival manual part.
Exactly. And the first non-negotiable step in his survival manual is what he calls reclaiming the intellectual arsenal. Drawing heavily on the clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson's ethos of cleaning your room, the author insists that men must ruthlessly clean their own mental rooms first before they can even think about fighting this broader cultural war.
Yeah, he is incredibly direct about this. He says you cannot possibly wage a war against the cultural matrix if your own mind is bogged down with the sludge of pop culture propaganda.
He specifically targets dopamine loops.
Right. We are talking about the endless, mindless scrolling on social media platforms and the hyperconsumption of internet pornography. He frames these things not just as bad habits or time wasters, but as literal tools of chemical castration.
The biological hack.
Yes, let me explain how he breaks this down biologically for the listener, because it's fascinating. He argues that the male brain evolved over hundreds of thousands of years for high-stakes, high-effort mammoth hunts. Men are neurologically wired to endure pain and overcome massive obstacles to achieve a goal.
But today,
that entire evolutionary circuitry is completely hijacked by the cheap, zero-effort dopamine hits of a smartphone notification or an adult website.
precisely. According to the text, this artificial digital system completely satiates the deep-seated male drive for conquest and sexual victory without requiring any actual competence, danger, or real-world achievement.
It tricks the brain.
It tricks the brain into thinking it has conquered the world, effectively rendering modern men into docile, passive, sedated consumers. And from the perspective of a ruling elite, a population of sedated, dopamine-addicted men poses absolutely no threat to the establishment.
You don't need to lock them in a physical gulag if they willingly lock themselves in a digital one.
Exactly.
So, assuming a man can actually break out of those dopamine traps and achieve some level of mental sovereignty, how does he fight back? This is where the book introduces its primary weapon, the ancient trivium.
Grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Right. The trivium consists of those three pillars. For centuries, this was the absolute bedrock of a classical Western education. But the author argues it was deliberately, methodically removed from the public school system, precisely to leave the general population totally defenseless against dialectical manipulation by politicians and the media.
Let's really dive into how he weaponizes each part of the trivium, starting with grammar. Now, when we say grammar, we aren't talking about where to place a comma or how to conjugate a verb.
No, it's much deeper than that.
The author says grammar is about defining the boundaries of reality itself. He accuses the cultural left of engaging in relentless semantic sabotage. They take established, universally understood words and deliberately mutate them to bypass rational debate.
Like the word sex.
Exactly. He notes how the objective biological word sex was systematically replaced by the linguistic term gender over the last few decades. The goal was to sever biological chromosomal reality from social identity.
And he mentions the word equality, too.
Right, look at how they twist the definition of equality. Classical equality means equal opportunity under the law, but it has been intentionally morphed into equity, which is a Marxist demand for mathematically equal outcomes across all groups, which the author notes can only be enforced by tyrannical state intervention.
Okay, so if you're listening to this and you are in a debate at work or at a dinner party, how do you actually combat that semantic sabotage?
Use the dictionary lock.
Yes. The author advocates for a highly aggressive tactical maneuver he calls the dictionary lock. He literally suggests carrying a physical printed dictionary, preferably an older edition from before the year 2000, to force your opponents to use established objective definitions rather than fluid, politically loaded ones.
It's a brilliant disruption tactic.
Let's play this out because I want you, the listener, to grasp how powerful this can be in a real conversation. If someone tries to debate you on gender identity, you don't argue their premises. You stop, open the dictionary, and read the literal definition of woman as an adult female human being.
Exactly. The power of the dictionary lock is that it forces the opponent to agree on basic reality before the argument can even proceed. If they refuse to accept the dictionary definition, you politely end the conversation.
Because there's no point.
Right, because they have admitted they are not tethered to objective reality. By forcing them to define their terms first, you completely prevent them from constantly shifting the goalposts or hiding behind vague, impenetrable academic jargon. It removes their ability to use words as emotional weapons.
That moves us perfectly to the second pillar of the Trivium logic, which is all about identifying fallacies and structural flaws in an argument. The author relies heavily here on Aristotle's ancient law of non-contradiction.
The classic.
For those who need a refresher, this is the foundational idea that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. A door cannot be completely open and completely closed simultaneously. He says grasping this one law is the ultimate shield against modern, postmodern relativism.
Yes, and he provides a very specific, devastating logical tool he calls the syllogism of irrefutability.
I love this part.
It's designed to absolutely destroy the most common postmodern claim of our era. The claim that all truth is subjective or there is no objective truth.
Break the logic down for us.
He breaks it down like this. If your opponent presents the major premise that all truth is subjective, you simply ask them if that specific statement, all truth is subjective, is itself an objectively true statement.
Right.
If they say yes, they have contradicted their own premise, proving that objective truth exists. If they say no, the statement is only subjectively true for them, which means you are under absolutely no logical obligation to believe it or accept it, rendering their entire worldview instantly discardable.
He calls this a logical atom bomb.
It really is. It entirely obliterates the foundation of critical theory in about 10 seconds of discourse.
That is incredibly satisfying to think about. Finally, we have the third pillar of the Trivium rhetoric, which he frames as the art of logical combat. The author warns readers about a very common debate tactic called the Gish Gallop.
We see this all the time on the news.
All the time. This is where an ideologue tries to overwhelm you by rapid-firing a torrent of half-truths, emotional buzzwords, and unconnected statistics so fast that you can't possibly refute them all.
So what's the defense?
His advice here is to seize what he calls the stasis point. You refuse to address the barrage. You pick one single claim, stop the conversation dead, and demand definitions and evidence for that one specific thing before moving on.
It halts their momentum completely.
Exactly. But beyond structural debates, he also deals with pure emotional hysteria. When facts fail, he says the opposition will almost always resort to vicious ad hominem attacks. They will call you toxic, a bigot, or a misogynist just to shut you up.
And this is where his tactical advice gets extremely granular and practical. He recommends a technique he calls the Socratic guillotine.
Let's role play this so the listener can really feel the mechanics of it.
Okay, so say you are in an HR meeting or a classroom, and someone angrily calls you toxic. The natural human instinct is to get defensive, to raise your voice and say, I'm not toxic.
Right, you want to defend your character.
But the author says that's exactly what they want. Instead, you use the Socratic guillotine. You remain completely calm, lower your voice and say, that is a very serious accusation. Could you please provide the exact clinical definition of toxic? And then point to the specific sentence I just uttered that meets that definition.
Wow. That puts the burden of proof entirely back on the accuser, and usually they freeze because they were just using the word as an emotional club, not a factual claim.
Precisely. And if that doesn't work, he suggests an even bolder move, the emotional Aikido redirect.
This one takes some nerve.
It does. This is where you don't even bother asking for definitions. You just absorb the energy of the attack and amplify it. If someone calls you a sexist for acknowledging biological differences, you don't defensively deny it. You own the underlying premise to expose the absolute absurdity of their worldview.
Agree and amplify.
Right. You agree and amplify saying something like, if observing basic human biology makes me a sexist, then yes, absolutely. Tell me, do you personally believe that ovaries and bone density are social constructs invented by the patriarchy? By pushing their insult to its logical, ridiculous extreme, you completely diffuse the emotional charge of the slur. Ultimately, the foundation of all of this is what he calls the Stonewall technique. You must cultivate the mindset of an unbothered stoic. You treat their insults and screams as mere atmospheric noise, completely impervious to their attempts at emotional manipulation.
It is a very combative, rigorous, and completely unapologetic approach to public discourse. And the author applies this uncompromising logic directly to one of the most highly charged, controversial topics of our time, the biological reality of sex differences versus what he bluntly terms the feminist lie.
Yes, section 3 of the deep dive.
Section 3 really gets into the hard evolutionary biology that underpins his entire worldview. The author is on an absolute mission to completely destroy the blank slate myth.
And this is everywhere in modern academia.
Everywhere. This is the prevailing academic idea that men and women are born with identical brains, identical software, and that all behavioral differences, what boys like to play with versus what girls like to play with, are entirely just arbitrary social constructs imposed by society.
To dismantle this blank slate theory, the author points to deeply tragic historical evidence, specifically highlighting the heartbreaking case of David Reimer.
This case is just so tough to read about.
For listeners who don't know this story, Reimer was a victim of Dr. John Money in the 1960s. Money was a highly influential psychologist at Johns Hopkins who was fiercely ideologically committed to social constructionism, the idea that gender is learned, not innate.
So what did he do?
After a tragically botched circumcision in infancy destroyed Reimer's anatomy, Dr. Money convinced Reimer's parents to surgically alter the boy and raise him entirely as a girl, naming him Brenda, just to prove to the academic world that gender is entirely a product of upbringing.
And the results of that experiment were absolutely catastrophic, weren't they?
Beyond catastrophic. Despite relentless, aggressive social conditioning, being dressed in pink, playing with dolls, and being pumped full of female hormones, Reimer suffered immense psychological agony his entire childhood.
His brain knew he was a boy.
Exactly. His brain knew he was a boy, even if everyone around him told him he was a girl. As a teenager, upon discovering the truth, he immediately reverted to his biological male identity, took the name David, and tried to live a normal life. But the trauma was too deep, and he tragically took his own life years later.
Oh, it's so sad.
It is. The author uses this horrifying story as searing, undeniable proof that consciousness follows biology, not the other way around.
Yeah.
You cannot socially engineer away millions of years of mammalian evolution.
I remember reading that section. It was incredibly heavy. But he follows it up with a fascinating anthropological phenomenon that I had never even heard of. I was blown away by this.
The Govidoses.
Yes. He cites the Glevidoses of Salinas, a remote village in the Dominican Republic. Let me explain this to you because it is wild. In this village, there are children born with a rare genetic condition involving an enzyme deficiency. At birth, they appear entirely female, so their parents, naturally, raise them socially as girls.
They wear dresses, do girl chores.
Right, they are treated by the village as girls. But at puberty, a massive natural surge of testosterone hits their system, causing them to literally develop male anatomy. The crazy part. The author points out that these children effortlessly, naturally transition into living as men. They drop the female socialization instantly.
They don't miss a beat.
He says this fundamentally proves that the physical body and its hormones dictate the mind. If gender were truly just a social performance you learn, these kids would keep performing femininity because it's all they ever knew. But they don't. Their biology takes over.
The author anchors these dramatic examples in a much broader, scientifically established concept known as the organizational hypothesis.
Let's define that.
This is the undeniable biological reality that a heavy bath of fetal testosterone in the womb permanently structures and organizes the male brain long before the child ever sees a pink or blue toy. It creates a physical hardware setup in the brain that is geared towards spatial ability, risk-taking, systemizing, and object focus.
And he says you can see this on your own body.
Yes, the author notes that you can actually observe a physical marker of this prenatal testosterone exposure on your own hand right now. It's called the 2D.4D digit ratio.
Wait, explain how the listener can actually look at this right now. What does that mean?
If you look at your hand, compare the length of your index finger, the second digit, or 2D, to the length of your ring finger, the fourth digit, or 4D. In men who received a high dose of testosterone in the womb, the ring finger is noticeably longer than the index finger.
And in women?
In women, they tend to be roughly the same length. This physical ratio strongly correlates with traits like physical aggression, athletic ability, and spatial reasoning.
That is wild.
The author argues that claiming male behavioral traits are just a toxic social construct imposed by a patriarchy is as scientifically illiterate as claiming the length of your fingers is determined by a patriarchy. It is hard-coded into our biology.
The text then dives incredibly deep into what is known as the neurosexism debate in modern academia. He cites leading researchers, neuroscientists, and evolutionary psychologists mentioned heavily in the text, like Dave Brousseau, Larry Cahill, and David Geary.
These scientists have the MRI data to back it up.
Right. They demonstrate through concrete MRI studies and vast cross-cultural data sets that male and female brains are simply architecturally distinct. The data shows that men consistently dominate hierarchy and status-seeking behaviors across all known human cultures, while women consistently prioritize dyadic relationships and empathy-driven social cohesion.
And from this solid bedrock of biological reality, the author constructs what he calls the syllogism of specialization.
This makes so much sense when you read it.
He argues that men and women have distinct, highly complementary biological functions designed for the survival of the species. Therefore, the modern feminist attempt to force a mathematically perfect 50-50 egalitarian parity in all professions, demanding 50% female CEOs and 50% male kindergarten teachers, is a literal war against physics and biology.
It's unnatural.
He argues that trying to force equal outcomes completely ignores natural biological preferences, and doing so requires massive state coercion, which leads inevitably to societal misery, inefficiency, and resentment.
And speaking of societal inefficiency, this brings us to a major explosive economic argument in the book, the so-called gender pay gap. The author completely and utterly rejects the mainstream narrative that women are paid 77 cents on the dollar for doing the exact same work as men due to systemic patriarchal oppression.
He renames it, doesn't he?
He does. He calls that narrative a statistical fraud and renames it the choices gap.
According to the author's deep dive into the economic data, when labor economists actually control for all the relevant variables, like total hours worked per week, willingness to commute, continuous years of unbroken experience, and most importantly, actual career choice, the mystical pay gap completely vanishes.
It just disappears.
Statistically speaking, women as a cohort tend to prioritize flexibility, physical safety, pleasant working environments, and time for family. Men, on the other hand, are driven by deep evolutionary pressures to accumulate resources specifically to attract mates. Therefore, men prioritize capital accumulation and status above all else, willingly choosing high-risk, high-stress, high-reward professions.
And to definitively prove this point, the author highlights something he calls the death gap, citing the groundbreaking work of author Warren Farrell. This is a statistic you'd never hear on the evening news. Men make up roughly 93% of all workplace fatalities.
93%.
Men completely and utterly dominate the 25 most dangerous, dirty, and physically destructive jobs in society. We are talking about deep sea welders, lumberjacks, highline electrical workers, roofers, and sanitation workers. The author argues that this proves undeniably that men trade their physical safety, their health, and often their lives for status and capital.
To look at that and call it oppression.
Right, to look at the resulting income disparity and call it oppression against women is, in his words, a malicious, ungrateful deceit.
The author then connects this relentless male economic drive directly to the brutal, unforgiving realities of the modern dating market. He leans heavily on foundational evolutionary biology, specifically Robert Triver's parental investment theory and Angus John Bateman's principle.
Let's put that simply for the audience.
To put it simply, these evolutionary theories explain that because human females bear the massive, heavy metabolic costs of gestation, pregnancy, and nursing a helpless infant, they are the high investment sex. Because their reproductive window is limited and costly, they're naturally wired to be the choosy selectors.
And men are the opposite.
Right. Men have a very low biological investment in reproduction. They produce millions of sperm a day. Therefore, men are the biological competitors who must constantly prove their utility,
the strength, and their resource-gathering ability to be selected.
This biological dynamic is what drives female hypergamy. For you listening who might be new to this term, hypergamy is the innate evolutionary drive for women to mate up and across dominance hierarchies. They instinctively seek partners who have higher social status, more resources, and greater physical dominance than they do.
And he brings the data from dating apps to prove it.
Yes, the absolute receipts. He cites data scraped from modern dating apps like Tinder and OkCupid, pointing out the brutal reality of the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule. The data consistently shows that roughly 80% of female attention and right swipes are directed almost exclusively at the top 20% of men.
It's winner take all.
Exactly. The author argues that the sexual revolution, by completely unmooring society from the stabilizing constraints of monogamous institutional marriage, hasn't liberated us. Instead, it has reverted human mating back to primitive, winner-take-all harem dynamics, leaving the vast silent majority of average working-class men completely disenfranchised and sexually invisible.
He goes even further into the dark corners of evolutionary psychology here, detailing what is known as the dual mating strategy, a concept sometimes bluntly referred to in the manosphere as alpha fucks, beta bucks.
Right, I've heard that phrase a lot.
The author explains that evolutionary pressures drive women to seek two entirely different things that are rarely found in the same man. They want the best, most dominant genes for the survival and physical fitness of their offspring, the genetically dominant alpha male. But they also need the best provisioning, safety, and long-term security for raising that offspring, the stable, hardworking beta provider.
And he backs us up with the science of the ovulatory shift, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He discusses empirical studies showing the ovulatory shift, where a woman's subconscious physical preferences actually swing wildly based on where she is in her monthly fertility cycle.
So during peak fertility.
During peak fertility, she is drawn to highly masculinized faces, deep voices, and dominant, arrogant, behavior-seeking genetic dominance. But during infertile periods of her cycle, her preferences shift towards softer, more agreeable men who signal resource stability and paternal investment.
And what's his conclusion on modern feminism from this?
His controversial conclusion here is that modern feminism serves to mask this ruthless biological algorithm behind a shiny moralistic myth of equality. He claims feminism is essentially a collective strategy used to extract and usurp male resources through the state while simultaneously avoiding the traditional burdens and compromises of lifelong monogamous commitment.
It is a stark, incredibly unforgiving view of human nature. You can see why we needed that impartiality disclaimer at the beginning. But the author doesn't just leave it at biology. He grounds this raw perspective deeply in philosophy, specifically in Section 4, where he explores the works of Arthur Schopenhauer, ancient Stoicism, and the concept of the masculine will.
He leans very heavily on Schopenhauer.
Yes, the famously pessimistic 19th century German philosopher.
Schopenhauer's foundational concept of the will to life is central to understanding the author's framework here. Schopenhauer posited that the will is the blind, irrational, striving force behind all biological existence. It's the drive just to survive and reproduce.
So how does Riker apply that?
According to the author's specific reading of Schopenhauer, women are fundamentally biologically tethered to the concrete preservation of the species. Because their bodies are the literal conduits for reproduction, their psychological nature inherently prioritizes the immediate material and emotional needs of offspring above all abstract concepts or grand virtues.
Men.
Men, on the other hand, freed from the direct physical burden of carrying children, act as the intellectual agents of the species. They are driven by the will to conquer the abstract world, pushing civilization forward through architecture, reason, law, and what the modern philosopher Thomas Nagel calls the view from nowhere.
The view from nowhere.
Yes, which is the masculine capacity for cold, objective, detached reasoning that ignores personal feelings.
The author argues that the modern world has completely abandoned this masculine objectivity, replacing it with subjective emotional chaos. He warns of the overwhelming danger of what he calls the gynocentric norm. He says society inherently and universally privileges female safety over male life, and always has.
He uses the maritime rule as an example.
Right. To prove this, he points to the historical maritime rule of women and children first when a ship goes down, or the contemporary legal fact that only men are required to register for the military draft under threat of federal prison. He says society fundamentally views men as disposable utilities, biological bricks to be ground up and stacked in the wall of the state, while women are treated as the protected, invaluable VIPs of the species.
So he completely rejects the oppression narrative.
Entirely. Therefore, he concludes that the foundational feminist narrative that women are and have always been a historically oppressed class is a mathematical and historical lie. Oppression, he brilliantly notes, does not come with a bodyguard.
To counter this pervasive societal narrative, the author insists that individual men must stop apologizing and instead fully embrace natural hierarchies. He connects Schopenhauer's philosophical will to modern biology, famously citing Jordan Peterson's work on lobsters and evolutionary biologist Robert Wright's extensive studies on baboon troops.
The dominance hierarchy studies.
Yes, these studies show definitively that dominance hierarchies are not a new invention. They are 350-million-year-old biological feedback loops governed heavily by neurochemicals like serotonin and testosterone. When a male baboon successfully wins a status challenge or a physical confrontation, his serotonin spikes, making him stand taller and act more confidently.
Then when he loses?
When he loses, his serotonin plummets and he physically shrinks away. The author aggressively asserts that male competition, aggression, and the resulting unequal hierarchies are not arbitrary, toxic, patriarchal constructs that need to be dismantled by HR departments. They are the fundamental evolutionary engine that drives group survival, technological innovation, and greatness.
So, assuming you, the listener, buy into this entire biological and historical framework, what is the philosophical remedy? How does an individual man operate while facing such a hostile culture? The author points directly to the ancient Stoics, specifically the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his concept of amor fati.
The love of one's fate.
Right, the love of one's fate. He calls on men to stop whining. He says you must accept the heavy, dangerous, unforgiving burden of masculinity without a single complaint. Do not whine about the hand you are dealt by modern society. Play it with absolute ferocity.
Build the internal citadel.
Yes, build your internal citadel, embrace the struggle of being the disposable sex, and reject the modern victimhood mentality entirely, because victimhood is inherently anti-masculine.
That internal fortitude, that mental armor, is absolutely necessary because as we transition into Section 5, the author maps out the external battlefield, the institutional war, and the deconstruction of critical race theory. Having established the biological baseline and the philosophical mindset, he turned his sights on exactly how the modern workplace and the legal system have been explicitly weaponized against competent men.
Let's zoom out and look at the modern workplace, which the author cynically calls the corporate feminism industrial complex. He paints a terrifying dystopian picture of modern human resources departments. He frames them not as helpful administrative support teams that manage payroll, but as Soviet-style internal police forces.
The HR commissariat.
Exactly. Their primary unstated goal, he argues, is the ruthless enforcement of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI orthodoxy. They exist to protect the company from frivolous discrimination litigation while systematically identifying and neutering any behavior they deem masculine toxicity.
Which usually just means aggressive competence or speaking blunt truths.
Exactly right.
The author formulates a devastating syllogism to prove that this intense focus on DEI inevitably leads to institutional collapse. He argues logically that competent, high-functioning organizations must focus exclusively on meritocratic output and objective truth to survive in a competitive market.
Because merit keeps the lights on.
Right. DEI, however, by its very definition, focuses on identity politics, subjective feelings, and arbitrary demographic parity. Therefore, DEI inherently distracts from and dilutes meritocratic results. He points to the recent, highly publicized catastrophic engineering failures at major aerospace companies like Boeing.
Doors falling off planes.
Yes. He uses this as terrifying real-world proof that when a culture prioritizes identity and diversity quotas over hardcore engineering merit, planes literally start falling out of the sky.
He also brings up a massive cultural flashpoint to prove that consumers hate this ideology, the infamous 2019 Gillette razor advertisement. This is a prime example of corporate feminism backfiring spectacularly.
The backlash on that was insane.
For those who don't remember, Gillette ran a massive marketing campaign actively attacking toxic masculinity. They essentially spent millions of dollars to lecture their own primary customer base men about their inherent moral flaws, telling them to stop bullying and harassing people as if all men are naturally predisposed to evil.
It was incredibly insulting.
The author notes that the market rejected this insult instantly and brutally. The backlash was so severe that it stripped the parent company, Procter & Gamble, of roughly $8 billion in market value within days. He uses this as definitive proof that prioritizing woke ideology over a basic respect for the masculine drive inevitably leads to financial ruin.
But the author notes that the economic war against men extends far beyond corporate HR departments. It reaches deep into the sanctity of the family unit itself. He provides a scathing, data-heavy critique of the modern family court system, which he views as nothing more than a massive state-sponsored wealth transfer mechanism designed to strip men of their assets.
The family court stuff is bleak.
He outlines the horrifyingly common silver bullet tactic in divorce proceedings. This is where false, or entirely unprovable, allegations of domestic abuse or fear are weaponized by a spouse's legal team to secure an immediate ex parte eviction of a man from his own home,
Before he can even defend himself.
instantly guaranteeing temporary custody and total financial control for the woman before the man even gets to speak to a judge.
The statistics he cites in this section are brutal. He points out that women initiate between 70 to 80% of all divorces in the United States, and yet men end up paying approximately 97% of all court-ordered alimony.
97%.
The author argues that the modern welfare state and the heavily biased family court system act as a massive substitute beta provider. They economically incentivize women to casually break the lifelong marital contract because the courts allow them to extract the man's accumulated capital, his house, and his future labor, all while stripping him of his daily access to his children.
He quotes Scruton again here.
Yes, noting that this state intervention deliberately breaks the little commonwealth of the nuclear family, leaving both individuals and children isolated, vulnerable, and entirely dependent on the bureaucratic state.
From the destruction of the family, the author then shifts his analytical focus to another major institutional weapon used to tear down classical systems: critical race theory, or CRT. He views CRT not as a legitimate historical critique of past injustices, but as a malicious, deeply cynical ideological virus designed specifically to dismantle merit-based competence hierarchies.
He zeroes in on Robin DiAngelo, right?
Yes, he specifically deconstructs Robin DiAngelo's wildly popular concept of white fragility, identifying it as a textbook Kafka trap.
Let's pause and explain that. What exactly is a Kafka trap? Let's do a real-world example of how this plays out in a modern corporate setting.
A Kafka trap is a logical fallacy where a person's denial of a crime is actually taken as evidence of their guilt. It comes from the nightmarish novels of Franz Kafka. So let's say you are a manager in a mandatory corporate DEI seminar. The instructor accuses you and the company of harboring subconscious, systemic racial bias.
All right, setting the scene.
If you nod your head and agree, you are admitting you are a racist. But if you raise your hand, use data, and calmly deny that you are a racist, the instructor will tell you that your defensiveness and your reliance on data is proof of your fragility, which is itself a symptom of your deep-seated racism.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. If you agree, you're guilty. If you disagree, your disagreement proves you're guilty. It is an unfalsifiable psychological weapon that leaves absolutely no room for rational defense or evidence.
It is a totally rigged game. He also sets his sights on Ibram X. Kendi's anti-racist framework. The author explains that Kendi's brand of CRT relies entirely on a logical fallacy called affirming the consequent.
Explain how that works.
This is the assumption that because disparities exist between demographic groups in society, systemic racism must be the one and only cause. It completely and intentionally ignores all other massive statistical variables like cultural differences, geographical distribution, median age, or individual behavioral choices.
It's a closed loop.
Right. The author argues that Kendi's theory is a closed, paranoid logical loop. It seeks to replace a functional society based on hard merit and objective truth with a matriarchy of victimhood, where social status and resources are awarded not for achievement or competence, but for accumulating points in an endless oppression Olympics.
Now, this brings us to section 6, which I have to admit is perhaps one of the most surprising, unique, and genuinely fascinating parts of the entire book. We transition from the abstract realm of institutions and legal theories into the physical world, weaponizing aesthetics against ugliness.
I loved this section.
The author makes a profound pivot here. He argues that the war on Western civilization isn't just being fought in courtrooms, university lecture halls, and HR departments. It is being fought right in front of your eyes, in the physical environment.
Architecture and design.
Exactly. He contrasts the soaring, transcendent, awe-inspiring beauty of classical Gothic cathedrals and Greco-Roman architecture with the brutalist, depressing concrete slabs designed by 20th century modernist architects like Le Corbusier.
Yeah, the author argues that the Frankfurt School and their cultural Marxist allies in the art and architecture worlds deliberately promoted ugly, mechanistic, soul-crushing architecture to psychologically demoralize the public. He says they wanted to cure regular people of their bourgeois attachment to traditional, beautiful culture by literally forcing them to live and work in soulless, gray concrete boxes.
It's a visual assault.
It is. He paints this incredible visual contrast between the vibrant, intricate historical streets of pre-war Vienna or Paris and the dehumanizing, prefabricated Plattenbau housing blocks of Soviet East Germany.
The author doesn't just treat this as a matter of objective taste. He grounds this aesthetic argument in hard biology and mathematics. He cites the famous biologist E.O. Wilson's concept of biophilia, which is the innate evolutionary human need to connect with nature and organic fractal forms.
We literally need beauty to survive.
Yes. He points out that clinical studies show subjecting humans to the sharp, non-organic, windowless angles of brutalist architecture actually spikes their cortisol levels and induces chronic stress. He also heavily invokes the golden ratio, or by the mathematical proportion of 1.618 found throughout the natural world in the spirals of galaxies, the petals of sunflowers, and the layout of the Parthenon.
It's mathematical perfection.
The author asserts forcefully that beauty is not a subjective social construct in the eye of the beholder. It is an objective mathematical reality. It is the fingerprint of the divine order. By deliberately severing us from this classical beauty and surrounding us with ugliness, the ideological left severs our psychological connection to the true, the good, and the beautiful.
So what is the actionable advice here for the individual guy listening to this? How do you fight an architectural war? The author tells his readers to radically reclaim their immediate physical environment. He literally says, and I quote, "Throw out your minimalist, disposable IKEA furniture."
No more particle board.
Exactly. He argues that this cheap particle board flat pack aesthetic is the physical manifestation of consumerist serfdom. It is designed to break and be thrown away, just like modern relationships. Instead, he urges men to surround themselves only with heavy, permanent materials: solid oak wood, raw stone, thick leather, and forged metal.
The purpose of this interior design advice isn't just decorative, it is deeply psychological and spiritual. The author argues that intentionally curating your personal space with permanent, high-quality, historically grounded materials cultivates something the ancient Greeks called thumos.
Thumos, spiritedness.
Yes, thumos translates roughly to spiritedness, righteous indignation, and the deep masculine thirst for excellence and legacy. By anchoring your physical body in an environment that reflects classic Western craftsmanship and permanence, you literally inoculate your subconscious mind against the disposable, nihilistic, fleeting nature of the woke mind virus.
That physical environment is just one part of the ultimate solution, which leads us seamlessly into our final section, building the counterculture, or what he calls the Renaissance. The author is very pragmatic. He recognizes that the legacy institutions, the old media, the Ivy League, the major corporations are largely captured and beyond saving from the inside.
So you have to opt out.
Right. So he provides a comprehensive roadmap for opting out and building anew. He starts with what he calls the digital agora.
He notes that the intellectual capital of the West has been rapidly migrating away from heavily censored legacy tech platforms like Reddit, Google, and Facebook. He claims these older platforms are governed by a feminine, consensus-seeking algorithmic model that prioritizes emotional safety and the suppression of offense over objective truth.
So where is everyone going?
Instead, rationalists and dissident thinkers are moving to the uncensored manosphere, to independent platforms like Substack, and to private, encrypted Discord servers. The author views Elon Musk's hostile acquisition of X, formerly Twitter, as a pivotal, world-changing Gutenberg moment.
Because it broke the monopoly.
It's exactly. By smashing the state corporate censorship monopoly, Musk proved that decentralized networks can actively overcome the ideological gatekeepers and allow raw, masculine debate to flourish in public again.
Beyond just the digital world, the author calls for a total, uncompromising intellectual exit in the real world. He tells his readers to completely abandon the prestige of legacy Ivy League universities like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, describing them as decaying, overpriced indoctrination camps focused entirely on grievance studies and self-hatred.
They've lost their classical mandate.
Yeah. Instead, he points the listener to classical, uncompromised institutions like Hillsdale College and the newly formed University of Austin, or UATX, which still rigorously teach the great books of the Western canon and the Trivium.
For families, the author advocates for a massive structural shift toward local homeschooling co-ops and a return to the medieval guild or apprenticeship system, advising young men to completely bypass the corrupt, debt-saddling university degree filter altogether. He leans heavily on the philosopher Nassim Taleb's concept of anti-fragility here.
Anti-fragility is key here.
Centralized legacy institutions are massive, but they are brittle and easily captured by ideological parasites. But decentralized parallel structures, like a local network of homeschooling fathers or a tight-knit professional trade guild, don't just survive under pressure, they are anti-fragile. They actually adapt, learn, and grow significantly stronger when attacked by the establishment.
And on a deeply personal level, for the individual man, the author advocates for a lifestyle known in the manosphere as monk mode. This means deliberately and aggressively withdrawing your participation from the rigged modern dating market and the corporate HR meat grinder. Stop chasing women who despise you, and stop giving your best labor to corporations that will fire you for a tweet.
Conserve your capital.
Yes, you redirect all of that immense masculine capital, time, and energy into intense self-improvement and building independent, untrackable wealth. He specifically champions decentralized finance, like Bitcoin and crypto, to completely insulate yourself from the banking system and state extraction.
Coupled directly with this period of monk mode is the creation of what he calls logos clubs. The author envisions a network of these local, physical, invite-only gatherings where men can meet in the real world. The goal is to train their bodies through heavy weightlifting and combat sports, and train their minds by debating classical philosophy, economics, and history without fear of HR reprisal.
It's like a modern symposium.
It is a direct, intentional return to the concept of the ancient Greek gymnasium. He believes this will foster a new generation of complete warrior philosophers who are physically imposing, intellectually rigorous, and totally unbreakable by modern propaganda.
The author ends this massive, sweeping manifesto with a cyclical view of history. He argues that the cultural decline we are currently witnessing, which he traces back in earnest to the cultural revolutions of 1968, is not the end of the world. It is mathematically guaranteed to end.
The pendulum swings back.
Yes. He argues that after 50 to 100 years of institutional decay, the pendulum of history always reaches its apex and swings violently back. And he firmly believes that the impending swing will be led by the unapologetic, raw, masculine will, forging a massive new renaissance of Western civilization built on the ashes of the woke bureaucracy.
The scope of Riker's work is undeniably vast and ambitious. He synthesizes complex evolutionary biology, ancient classical philosophy, and bare-knuckle economic analysis to diagnose a civilization in deep crisis. And regardless of whether one agrees with his premises, he offers a very specific, highly aggressive, and meticulously thought-out path out of the darkness.
So we always ask at the end of these deep dives, what does this all mean for you? For the target audience of this book, this text isn't just an interesting cultural critique to read on a Sunday afternoon. It is a comprehensive, necessary intellectual survival manual for operating in a deeply hostile culture.
A roadmap for the counterculture.
It's a clarion call to clean your mind of digital sludge. Weaponize classical logic. Deeply understand the unapologetic biological realities of the world. Ruthlessly protect your physical and financial assets and build unbreakable parallel structures alongside other rational, strong men.
It certainly challenges the very foundations of every modern societal norm we've been taught for the last 50 years. And it leaves us with a lingering, deeply provocative question to ponder as we close. If the most competent, driven, and historically productive builders of society, the men who lay the bricks, write the code, and maintain the grid, completely opt out of mainstream institutions to build their own parallel decentralized networks, their own guilds, their own schools, their own financial systems, what actually happens to the legacy systems left behind?
That's the million-dollar question.
Do the massive universities and corporations humble themselves and adapt to win those competent men back? Or do they simply rot and collapse under the immense unproductive weight of their own bureaucracy?
That is a fascinating, almost terrifying thought to chew on. If the builders leave, the building inevitably falls. All right, that brings us to the end of this truly massive journey. We want to remind you once again to please like and subscribe to the deep dive so we can keep doing this.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
And if you want to explore the source material yourself and see exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes, go to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy The Living Spirit. Resurrecting the West by Conrad Riker. Also, make absolutely sure to follow him at Conrad News Riker on Substack. Thank you so much for taking this intense, unapologetic deep dive with us today. Until next time, stay sharp.